I'm glad to see everybody showed up just to hear me talk. Had nothing to do with lunch, I'm sure, so it's good to be the one right before lunch that gets the microphone. And I'm not even sure about what this slide deck says because I didn't put it together, so we'll take this journey together on this. So I get a little chance to advertise our company. That's not what I'm here to talk about entirely, but I think the pipeline story is interesting. We think we're filling a void in the marketplace that should be helpful for growers in particular who are looking to expand their marketing opportunities for organic grains. But we're a global organization. The buzzwords in the industry today are sustainability, traceability, transparency. The consumer has an expectation about learning more about where their food comes from, and the organic and non-GMO space in particular is sort of helping to fill that consumer demand, that need not only for product but for information about where product comes from. We're focused exclusively, so one of the unique things about our company is we're not just a desk in the middle of a big commodity house. We're an organization focused solely on organic and non-GMO grains and oilseeds and their derivative ingredients. So we do nothing in terms of produce or fruit, and we're not directly involved in animal protein production, so we don't directly get involved in developing meat, milk, or egg markets, but we work closely with that sector in terms of feed grains and ingredients. We're committed to operating within an environmental, social, and governance framework. This may not be a familiar term in farm country, but again, at the consumer end and also in the financial world, this term is increasingly having meaning, and you can understand what it says. We're going to operate along certain frameworks that are environmentally responsible, that are socially responsible, and that also we're going to have a high degree of governance, not only for our business, but we're going to extend that view into the customers that we work with, the vendors that we work with, and we will help the growers to the extent they need our help in governance areas, meet the needs of the current and the new needs in the food market. And the other term that's reaching, you may or may not have been hearing about this, but the regenerative ag movement is picking up steam. It hasn't been well defined yet, so we're sitting at the table and trying to bring food companies together to help us understand what they mean by that term. But I think one of the reasons that term has come into being is because the term sustainability has kind of been watered down and lost meaning, and everybody seemed to have co-opted that term to mean anything, so it means nothing. So the regenerative ag movement, I think, is really meant to focus in on things that agriculture can do beyond creating food, particularly in terms of environmental outcomes. Soil health is an important part of this. The pollinator habitat is an important part of this discussion. Water quality outcomes, water quantity usage, biodiversity in general. These are all part of the discussion around regenerative ag, but it hasn't been pinpointed yet, and that's going to take a little bit of time. It feels to me like it's going to cut across all types of agriculture, so it's not only going to be with regards to organic agriculture. Regenerative ag also can have meaning in the conventional world. So hopefully this is a unifying conversation, not a divisive conversation, which we've been having a little bit of between the organics and the conventionals. But it remains to be seen. We're still in early days of the use of that term. But ultimately, again, at the consumer end, clean label, food supply, understanding the ingredients that are in your food and where they came from, the practices used to grow those, is a big driver at the consumer end of the market. So we're based in Minneapolis. Our headquarters is in Minneapolis. We have a Canadian headquarters in Winnipeg. We've got a South American headquarters in Buenos Aires, and we have a couple people in an office in New York, and we've got a couple people in an office in St. Louis. We're 38 weeks and 4 days into this, so we're just getting the wheels on the bus. We own and operate assets, so that's our core business. I raised capital to buy and build assets dedicated to the organic and non-GMO grains and oilseed space. So grain elevators, grain processing, oilseed crushing, veg oil refining, feed milling, all the midstream assets that are typical. We're not doing anything really sexy here. You know, this isn't new technology. We're just taking the same understanding that we all learned in the conventional space and trying to right size it for this relatively smaller but quickly growing space. To date, we have, so in the few months that we've been up and running, we've purchased 3 grain elevators. We started moving dirt for a new grain terminal, and we bought a little oilseed crushing operation. So our two of our grain elevators are in Saskatchewan. One is in the northwest corner of North Dakota. We're moving dirt on a new grain terminal up in northwest North Dakota, a big $15 million project up there, kind of the biggest thing to happen up in that part of the world in the grain business in a long time. And then our oilseed crushing operation is down in the boot heel of Missouri. So the 4 assets up north are all part of a concerted strategy to provide service to the very large organic community in northern North Dakota and southern Saskatchewan. And the operation down in southern Missouri is dedicated to an interesting group, and increasingly interesting for me that there's this group that exists down there of folks that went non-GMO a long time ago, naturally due to glyphosate resistance. And they just went non-GMO to save money on a bag of seed, right? And then over time they've refined that, they've gotten better in terms of selecting the hybrids that really work down there very well. But now they want to take some of them want to take the next step and go to organic. So us having an asset there focused on being able to buy their soybeans is a valuable asset in that community, right? They have a local market, and we get to support their effort as they make the transition. We believe strongly in creating a shared value model. So I think the commodity industry has earned deservedly a reputation for being sort of a black box model. You know, you guys, the growers in the room, you get paid what you get paid, right? You have no idea what happens downstream. You have no idea, you have no visibility to what the actual end use of your product is in many cases, and certainly no idea about the value of your product. Our model is attempting to break that, and we're actually, again, being driven by the consumer side of this that actually wants to come back and see you guys. But we have found similarly a big openness to the growers that we work with that they'd also like to understand more about downstream. Where's my product going? How can I make it better? You know, I work really hard at this. This is a little bit different farming than conventional farming, and I'd like to participate in understanding more about the connectivity between me and whoever's eating my stuff, or you know, how it's being processed and further on downstream. So we share not only that information, but as we bring efficiency to the marketplace, because we invest money to create efficiency, right? That's what the whole grain system is all about. We're willing to share that margin with both the growers, so we're paying, you know, particularly in our northern tier, all those elevators up there, we're paying the growers much higher than they can get anywhere else. And similarly, we're charging the end user less than what they've been offered by other people. And the way that we're doing that is we're taking literally dollars a bushel out of the current system. Before we showed up, you know, up in Saskatchewan, a lot of that organic wheat, for example, was basically field run, relatively high dockage, as some organic can be when coming out of the field, loaded onto trucks and being shipped 1,000 miles. And the dockage was being shipped, and the grading was being done 1,000 miles away. Just by putting an elevator in the neighborhood, now we're cleaning locally, right? When your truck is there, we can give you a good grade on that product, whatever it is that you're shipping to us, and then we're putting it on rail, right? So we're shipping the 1,000 miles on rail, huge savings. That's how we're able to pay you guys more money if you're in our neighborhood, or we're in your neighborhood, I guess more accurately. And then we're also able to charge the food company less. So that shared value model, we think, is well, we know it's a new way of doing business. We hope that it becomes the way of doing business, and we're doing a little bit of pioneering in that. And again, transparent, traceability is important. And when you do all these things right, then you become a trusted, we have to earn that, we understand, but we become a trusted member of whatever community that we operate in. Is that making sense? Yeah, so this is just our existing footprint. Our elevators are in green, our offices are in red, and our plants, so the single processing plant we have is that little gold dot on there. Why an office in Buenos Aires or why an office in Winnipeg? Well, we'll talk about this in just a second. The organic market is going to be an import market into the U.S. for the foreseeable future. We're dedicated to growing our way out of that. We fundamentally think that's stupid, but it's a fact. And the only way that we're going to operate in the import space is with local operations in the countries in which we operate. We're not going to be part of a 4, 5, 6 trade string where product gets loaded on a magic boat, conventional product gets loaded on a magic boat someplace, and by the time it gets here, it's magically organic, right? That's going on. We're going to be the white knight in this industry if we can and try to clean this up a little bit. So that's why we have an office in Buenos Aires, is because Argentina is an important source of organic corn, beans, and wheat into the U.S. market. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. So in general, and I'm not the market expert, CJ is here to answer more specific questions if we have them. But the demand, and prior speakers talked about this, the demand is solid. I don't have to do any market research. All the food companies have done the market research for us, and it's in the paper every day. The market trend is clearly towards a cleaner finished product, and organic is sort of the headline of that. Non-GMO is participating in that market revolution. There will be more and more and more, in my opinion, subsectors of the market as time goes on, because the consumer has, she has a voting machine in her hand every day, right? Your cell phone is now connecting everybody. And whether it's true information or whether it's rumor, the point is that stuff travels very quickly. So the consumer now is part of a democratized information system, and that's going to continue to drive interest in more and more specialized food products. Domestic prices have stabilized. I mean, we were down a little bit lower. We're back up a little bit now on organic prices. We're certainly not at the levels we were before, but we'll talk about this in just a second too. We're seeing imports that are now being more closely scrutinized, and so that should be helpful to the domestic market as we move some of the fraudulent materials out of the marketplace. The headline risks, probably the biggest article in the paper was a couple months ago in the Washington Post. They did a very good job of detailing about this. This was a particular story about one ship, but it was indicative of the situation and what I call the magic boats. And they called out the various parties, right? I think there were 6 or 7 companies involved in that string of trades. And it's important for the segment, it's critical for the segment, but food companies increasingly now are facing what we call headline risk, because the spotlight's on the market, right? And the food companies are the ones ultimately that are going to have to pay the price if the consumer gets truly upset about what they thought was going on, and that's not actually what's going on in the organic grain space in particular. The food companies are all at risk because it's their brand, it's their reputation in the marketplace. And we have a big opportunity. I mean, that's what this room is about today, and I've spoken at other venues recently. We have a big opportunity to displace these imports with domestically grown grain. So it's not like we don't have the raw acres. But the fact is, last year, about 75% of the feed, organic feed in the U.S. that was fed as organic came from outside of the U.S. We're talking primarily corn and beans, and meal, and soy meal. The primary origins of these are the Black Sea area, India, particularly on soy, and South America on soy and corn. Now, there are some interesting quality attributes that might maintain, like, for example, the Indian soy presence here for a while. They have a good quality soy, but the fact that we're importing any corn or any beans into the U.S., we think is absolutely absurd. So we'll talk about this in just a minute, but our Farm Profit program is designed specifically to help encourage growers who either want to expand their organic acres or are considering for the first time making that jump. We're going to do our part to try to help make that easier. Yes, ma'am.
I'm convinced as you that people grow it here, but can we grow it below the cost that it's coming in?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, so the comment was made that convinced that we can grow the organic here, but can we grow it below the cost of the imports, right? So a couple of things. I think that those that have been in the organic space for a while, their cost of production is remarkably low. If you take it on a per bushel basis, they've gotten their yields to a reasonable level. I think there's a lot of myths in the organic space around yield. So that's one factor. So I think that the costs here are not as high once you've fully developed your organic system as they are during the first few years when you're still trying to figure it out. Number two, once we get rid of the fraudulent imports, the truth is the global demand for organic is there, right? So if you're fighting over smaller numbers of bushels, prices go up. So if we can get the fraudulent products out of the marketplace, that'll help stabilize and potentially increase prices. So I think those two dynamics, my answer is yes, but it's also partially dependent on location, right? So interestingly enough, in the interior of the US, which is where we're going to grow most of this stuff, that market's a long ways away from the import market. So particularly in the interior, we should be able to do really well. When you get out to the coasts, interestingly enough, where you're either going to ship from the Midwest to the coast, or you're going to bring it in on a boat, that market's a little bit trickier to figure out. But again, if demand keeps growing at 15% a year, like it has for the past decade, if you run those lines and you take a look at what we're growing here domestically, it's going to take millions of acres of organic domestically to catch up to that demand. I don't see us working our way out of a deficit situation here in the U.S. for at least another 10 years, no matter how fast we go. So my short answer is yes. My short answer is a well-developed organic system in the U.S., the cost of production will be well below the cost of imports, but it has to be developed. Yes, sir.
Maybe 6 months ago, Walmart got some media attention that they were going to enter the organic market and they were going to be 25%.
They were going to be what?
They were going to be 25% lower
in price?
Pricing from what is now in price, in supermarkets.
Yeah, and I think, well, so similarly, Amazon, when they took over Whole Foods, right? They came out with kind of a similar strategy. I'm not sure so you have to take a look across the whole range of products, right? The vast majority of what the grocery stores sell are going to be in the fresh produce aisle. So the pressure, first and foremost, is going to be in fruits and vegetables that are organic. The grain business is a little bit farther away. You know, your grain isn't sitting on the grocery store shelf. So the question, I think, is one of being more efficient domestically in the supply chain, particularly in the animal protein sector, which is one of the reasons we exist, is to take out some of these turns in the road. So if we do our job well and if the rest of the market does their job well, prices should be able to drop at the grocery store, even while prices at the farm level can still go up.
So then is Whole Foods and Walmart mainly these are going to be
That's a seasonal question. I mean, excuse me, we're not participating in that market, but the vast majority of the organic, or just produce in general, organic or conventional, right? We grow a lot of it here in the summertime, we import it in the wintertime. So that'll be an interesting question. Organic produce in the wintertime, if their goal is to drive down prices, I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work. I don't know if they intend to use it as a loss leader, but that's going to have to come from elsewhere just because of our seasons. So Mexico is a huge source of off-season conventional and organic produce. Latin America is increasingly participating in that. I don't understand their economic model on that, but they've always tried to drive towards the efficient model so they can present low prices. There's a lot of efficiencies in the grain business that have yet to be realized, and so both the farmer and the consumer is getting nicked in the deal because there's a lot of money wasted in between. So at least on the animal protein sector, which is where the vast majority of organic grain goes, is for feed. And also then in the food products like bread, if we can straighten out some of these twisted roads in between you and the consumer, those efficiencies can be shared on both ends. And I do expect consumers to pay lower and lower prices for organic, but again, if we do our job right, that should not negatively impact the farm gate. There's that much dead air in between those two pricing structures right now. Does that answer your question? Yes, thank you.
Yep. Where is the dead air? Dead air. Where is that?
Well, so not atypical in the organic grain space is you'll have 2, 3, 4 traders. Everybody's taking a margin, not necessarily adding value. You've got these long distances in trucks, right? We should be loading that stuff on rail. You've got very few processing locations. So an organic grain might start here, go halfway across the country to get processed, only to have the ingredient come back here. So that's why
The strategy is to take all that out.
as much as possible, right? By investing in capital into infrastructure and localizing things and being smart about where we put stuff, we'll at least take some of those inefficiencies out of the marketplace, right? And that's what this isn't really sexy stuff. This is just sort of reinventing the conventional theme on an appropriately scaled basis, and by dropping pins on the map in the right locations, we can take a lot of that transportation cost, is quite frankly the biggest piece, out of it. And then by eliminating 2 or 3 or 4 trading margins in the deal, that also saves a lot of cash. So, yes, sir.
So you just kind of have spoken to it here. What is your company's focus, or is it like a strategy for local markets as opposed to maybe shipping to these big manufacturers that wherever they may reside?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the entire marketplace is sort of evolving right now. And you see the excuse me. You see the big food companies struggling to try to figure out this relatively niche-y stuff. So they've got these big, huge processing operations, right, located where they're located, and those are not going to go away as long as they've got conventional business to run through them. So the question of how far do we go downstream in terms of processing stuff that then gets put into these foods remains to be seen. We're not going to be in the food, you're not going to see our brand on the shelf. We kind of think of ourselves as like Intel on the inside of a computer, right? We want to be rock solid in the middle of this deal. In terms of the local markets, I'm not sure that we have a role to play. So we're not trying to jam ourselves as a square peg into a round hole. Local markets, I think, can pretty well take care of themselves. It's, people coming together and investing in themselves locally. We're better suited to the cross-country business, so to speak. And that's because certain crops are grown in certain places and they're consumed everywhere. So that's how we stitch that together, if that makes sense. So again, consumer demand, this is not going to stop anytime soon. You see, we came off the peaks from a few years ago. You can definitely correlate. So high prices typically beget low prices, right? High prices create supply. So it was that high price structure. Whoops. Take your hand off the button. Well, I'm not going to use the pointer because that obviously gets me in trouble. But those high prices back, a few years ago, that was the beginning of the big import. People started saying, okay, well, we need more stuff. So those high prices are actually what drew the imports in. Fraudulent or not, there's plenty of true organic materials grown around the world that fit our marketplace. But we were not anywhere near, I mean, CJ, we've increased imports by 90%, right, in the last 3 years? Yeah. So in the last 3 to 4 years, imports have increased 90%.
Is that both on organic and conventional?
No, we don't import. I mean, that's the whole puzzling thing here, right? We're not going to import corn. We're not going to import soybeans. Everything that gets imported is going to be something special, right? So in this case, we're talking about organic. Wheat is also imported heavily, but primarily just from our neighbor to the north. But some of those acres belong here as well. So, but the high prices are what drew in the imports. And now that we're down to lower levels and there's higher scrutiny on the imports, prices are starting to slowly but surely move back up again. And we think that's going to be the trend in the future. So imports are down 23% year to date as the headlines start popping up in the newspaper. You may or may not like the work that some of these investigative reporters do, but they're pretty good at it. When they get a whiff of something that can turn into a scandalous story, they're all over it. So this is one of those scandalous stories, and they've been pretty diligent about getting on top of this. The other interesting thing too is that, for those of you who are selling directly into the food market or selling feed off farm, the Food Safety Modernization Act also now is part of the language. And what this is reclassified animal feed into animal food, and those of us that manufacture feed have to be more diligent. This is also potentially going to put a crimp on the imports because they're not all going to be able to be certified under the Foreign Supplier Verification Act to pass muster, so to speak, for the food safety piece. So the trends are coming in our direction. Now what we need growers to respond. We need growers to pick up the pace here domestically.
Just a comment.
Yep.
It's going back to that chart and how those things influence people. It's just, we're all farmers, whether we're conventional or GMO or non-GMO or organic. And sometimes I hear people say, oh, those organic people, or oh, those GMO people.
Yep.
We're all here trying to make a living and everybody needs a part, so it doesn't do us any, it hurts us to sometimes feed and say, oh, look at all those organic people, they're destroying, it's really not organic.
Right.
Whatever, and so we need to be protective of ag.
Ag, food, everybody's in it together, right?
Yes.
So totally agree. I mean, we talk to, well, obviously the vast majority of growers are conventional, right? And the growers that we're working with, most of them are using this as a diversification strategy, right? Some folks are 100% organic, and that's fine, right? But the folks that we're talking to that we're trying to get some conversion on their land, they're looking at it as a diversification strategy. So they're going to be at foot down in both camps. Somebody says, well, you're going to have to open up a psychology clinic for these guys, right? Because it's tough, particularly if you break ranks in your neighborhood, right? And you got the weedy field over here and you're doing something different. So I don't know how to answer that question other than we call our growers the Pipeline Nation, and we're trying to connect them to each other, so at least they have a support group amongst each other. And as we create density in certain areas, and we'd like our facilities to be sort of centers of excellence, so there's a community place to come together, share practices, and create community, because that's what happened in conventional agriculture years ago, right? Farmers stuck together. But you're absolutely right. This is we don't want this to be a divisive topic, right? It's just another way to produce food, and if it works for you, then here's an opportunity. You're exactly right.
It hurts the industry and hurts all food producers
When anybody gets called out.
when this happens
Yep.
or on the other side.
Yep,
It's,
we agree. So this is kind of back to what I was talking about before. This is a little different map. There was a map that was shown by the first presenter about organic acres, and that's a little tough to parse that out. The vast majority of organic acres in the U.S. are actually pasture acres. There's an awful lot of acreage that's in vegetables and fruits and higher value crops. The amount of row crop acres in the U.S. is abysmally small. But talking about corn and specifically the bushels, not the acres, this map is trying to show where there's a surplus of supply relative to a deficit of, created by demand. So it's not surprising that the coastal areas are where that's where all the people are, right? So that's where there's an awful lot of demand. And here in the Midwest, we produce a lot of supply. So a big part of our job is trying to connect the blue to the red. But that's also the challenge on the imports, because the imports come directly into where the red areas are, right? So that's why this is going to be a little bit slower go than if all of the demand were in the Midwest. We probably wouldn't have any imports. But that's just not where all the people are. But it's sure going to bring the market a lot closer together when we start shipping by rail instead of shipping by truck, right? It reduces your cost of transportation by 200%. And again, as we've started to clean up the imports, prices mysteriously have gone up. When you take the fraudulent materials out of the import channel, and now you're dealing only with organic, and we're maybe not quite there yet, but we're getting a lot closer, those prices are going to tend to head up, and we've now come to a kind of a parity price here. But we think that the opportunity, and we're hearing this more from food companies, is I want U.S. origin organic. So again, I talked about how the market's going to continue to fracture into more and more specialty spaces. U.S. organic, right? So the USDA stamp can be put on foreign materials, but customers increasingly are asking for U.S. organic. So we're going to have to be able to prove to them in those cases that their product came from the U.S. That's a huge opportunity for U.S. growers to plug straight into that program. I tried to find a couple of pictures that I thought kind of described the situation, right? So this is sort of the picture, if you will, of the organic grain supply chain. It isn't one, right? It's a bunch of farmers and a bunch of consumers, and nothing's connecting the dots. A big part of the problem is that there hasn't been very much investment in infrastructure to support the organic and non-GMO space. Traceability is horrible in the current situation, and the operating costs are very high. So we've already talked about that. CapEx and OpEx tend to offset each other. If you're not going to put money into capital infrastructure, you're going to pay the bill in operating expense. So this is what we hope to create. We hope to make it look more like a conventional space in terms of operating efficiency, with a hub and spoke type model. That's if we're do a good job of dropping pins on the map in areas that are supportive, Minnesota, Western Iowa, Boot Heel of Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. There's some obvious places that there's already a fair concentration of growers. If we can increase the concentration in those areas, everybody will benefit, because we'll be able to put capital to work in those areas in infrastructure and raise the boat for all the growers. It's a little bit hard for us. I can't just start throwing darts at a map and say I'm going to put a grain elevator here, right? Well, where's here? And how close am I to sufficient grain flows, even either current or future, to make economic sense out of that. So we've concentrated in areas where we know we can do good, and now our job is to try to grow more of these neighborhoods, if you will. So our current focus today has been southeast Missouri, northeast Arkansas, western Iowa, eastern Nebraska, Indiana, Ohio. Those areas are sort of ripe for growth, because if you go back to the map here, there's not a lot of acres in those areas yet, but they're close. Some of those areas are a little bit closer to the market. Iowa, I guess, would be the exception, but Indiana, Ohio, and again, trying to go where the path of least resistance. So, you know, if we show up in a neighborhood and suggest that growers go with our program and nobody wants to do it, we're not going to stick around and try to beat a dead horse. This market in southeast Missouri was interesting because those folks had already gone non-GMO years ago just to save money on a bag of seed. And now they're interested in exploring the organic market. So they're holding up their hands and saying, come here, right? If you build it, we will be here. So that's an easy choice for us to make. But again, after only 38 weeks, we're still in early exploration of where else we're going to put down roots. But in order to do this, again, a fair amount of investment is going to have to go in. So our company is forecasting that we are going to invest somewhere between $300 and $500 million over the next 3 to 5 years, someplace to make this work, right? We're early days. We've made 5 acquisitions. We've got a whole long list of stuff we're looking at. So we're buying in some cases, conventional assets, because it doesn't take any new technology to do this, and converting them to an IP program for organic and non-GMO. In other cases, we're building, like our new terminal up in North Dakota. And in yet other cases, we're talking with a lot of, I'd say, family businesses that have been fighting the good fight in this space for 30 years, and they're looking for either a growth partner or an exit, a way to monetize what they've been doing over all these years. So a lot of farmer-based or family-based projects that have been in the market for a while are sitting at our doorstep now asking if there's something that we can do together. So we're exploring what that all might look like. So as we went out and did our research and asked a lot of farmers, what stands in between you and as a conventional guy or as a smaller organic guy, and either growth in the organic space or a diversification strategy on some of your acres. The 3 things that we heard consistently were, boy, I don't know, I read about this market in the paper, but I don't necessarily, I don't see the market in my neighborhood. So marketing the crop on a consistent go-forward basis was a barrier, at least in their minds. A second one was agronomic support. The university extension program isn't helpful, the co-op isn't helpful. Who's going to hold my hand through this process and help me understand, and maybe I'll make mistakes, but maybe I don't have to make the same mistakes other people have made in the past. Maybe I can learn faster. And then the third piece is economic. Boy, 3 years is a long time, right? It takes 3 times 365 days from your last prohibitive application until your crop can be certified organic. And depending upon when you start that might actually be 3 full crop years that gets sacrificed while you're doing organic practices, and yet you're not getting paid the organic premium. And that just sounds scary. Not only does it sound scary, but a lot of banks bristle at the idea, right, of funding that sort of no man's land. So recognizing that those are the 3 primary barriers, let alone the psychological thing, which we can't figure out how to fix, we decided, okay, well, if we're sincere about making this business bigger and better, we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and get after this in a way that nobody else has that we've seen so far. So we created something called the Farm Profit Program, and I think the emphasis is on profit because we want to make sure that everybody understands that yes, it's a journey, but there is, I don't know if I want to call it a pot of gold, but there certainly is economic reward in the out years. So how do we help you get to those out years? How do we help bridge these three challenges? Well, first of all, the market side of it we've solved for. That's fundamentally what we do is we make the market. So if we can convince you of that, then the other two pieces are the agronomic and the economic. The agronomic piece, the way that we chose to solve for this was not to create an army of agronomists ourselves, but was to hire one individual so far, and many of you in the room probably know Anders Gerda, who is running the O-Grain program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Anders has joined recently, and one of his jobs is to identify and sort of vet organic agronomic support across the country. These are all very regional, there's not any big national organization that does this. These are regionally located folks that are either organic farmers that have decided to extend their knowledge by helping other farmers, or folks that have gotten into the business specifically to provide organic agronomic services. But we'd like to see some consistency in that program, and we'd also like to try to ferret out any of the snake oil guys before we introduce them to you, and you make a choice to use them. So we're being diligent about trying to pull together a network of agronomic resources, so no matter where you are in the country, we can introduce you to somebody that can be supportive. And then on the economic piece, we're in the process, we haven't quite accomplished this yet, but we're in the process of creating essentially an operating loan tool that's specifically targeted to help the financial stress. So this money might go to buy new equipment that you would need because you don't necessarily have the equipment that you're going to need to be an organic farmer. It could be to help offset yield stress during the transitional years. Yield stress coupled with higher labor costs, coupled with not getting paid a premium for the product. So whatever the cause of the economic stress is, we would be a non-bank loan source to the farmers that enter into our program, so that we can help to bridge some of the economic hurdle as well. So we're tackling the economic piece, we're tackling the agronomic piece. The market piece that's what we wake up and do every day, so we don't have to do anything new there other than explain to you how we would operate on a long-term basis going forward. So we think that that's a catalyst, we hope that that's a catalyst that we create to help transition a large number of acres. If we're wildly successful this year, we might drive 10,000 acres into the program, but we have a long-term goal. We have a 5-year goal of, through our program, driving 500,000 acres on a national basis, and that's still just scratching the surface. I mean, I can't do the math on this because there's a lot of uncertainties involved in it, but it will take millions of acres over time for domestic supply to catch up with domestic demand. We're going to try to put a dent in that. We're going to try to make a difference, move the needle in our own little way, and invest in the communities that nod their head yes and say we want to take that journey with you. Yes?
I'll apologize, I stepped in late to your presentation, but what crops are we talking about here that need an additional 5,000 acres besides corn and soybeans?
So corn, beans, wheat, easy peasy. All the pulses, peas, beans, lentils. Small grains are interesting, right? There's more and more demand being created for small grains because it's an important part of the crop rotation in certain parts of the country. What am I missing, CJ? Yeah. I mean,
Industrial hemp, because that seems to be growing in Canada.
yeah, I got a couple of calls on that. We don't know. I don't know what role we play in that yet. I mean, there are already some established hemp processors up in Canada, so it seems like everything's going that direction. We haven't talked to the folks here in Minnesota. The Minnesota Department of Ag put that program into place last year, and we got a call from a few growers. I didn't know how to help them on that yet. But I mean, the answer is yes, all right? If the markets appear, then we'll try to help serve those markets. Yes, sir.
Do you know anything about the electronic readers that are out there?
Electronic readers. Can you
Well, it's a machine that can differentiate crop from weed.
Crop from weed.
Yeah, and wipes it out. There's some stuff-
Oh, the electronic weeders.
Weeders.
I'm sorry, I thought you said readers. Yes. Yeah, there's an interesting German machine that uses electro something, right? I'm not a scientist, so I'm right at the edge of what I even know how to talk about. But I've seen the thing work. I mean, it'll go across a swath, right, and turn everything brown. No chemicals, no heat. They do it through electromagnetic currency or currents. I don't know how scalable that is, right? I mean, the thing I've seen is looks like it'd be great if you want to, clear the boulevard on your street. I'm not sure if it'd work at farm scale. So I think it really does work well, and I know the applications in vineyards and orchards where you're addressing a relatively small strip of land. I know that it's worked well there. I don't know on broad acre scale if it's practical. Technology exists, I just don't know if it's scalable to broad acre application or not. So again, if you catch up with me at various venues, I keep on beating the drum about the opportunity in the U.S., and we're dedicated to replacing imports over time, even while in the meantime our customer demand asks for product and we can't fulfill it domestically. So we'll do a very good job of doing things the right way on the import side, but that's not our long-term business plan. Our long-term business plan is bringing those acres home. So we're establishing interior facilities with advantaged logistics, the farm profit program that I already talked about. Another piece, which may or may not be terribly interesting to this group, but so on the front end is the farm profit program. On the consumer-facing side, we have something that we call the procurement services. Procurement meaning, we're talking to the buyers, but we're also talking to the sustainability departments in major food companies. We're talking to the compliance departments in major food companies. In some cases, we're talking to the marketing departments in major food companies, because oftentimes we find that those four departments don't talk to each other, and yet they're all involved in the game. Marketing goes out and says something wild, and now everybody else has got to figure out how to do it. Compliance gets all freaked out because of the headlines in the newspaper. Procurement is charged with buying stuff, but they don't really have a hammer in this market like they have in the conventional market, right? And sustainability, in some companies leads and in some companies follows this whole effort. So we're puzzling out with food companies how to get them in a position to be able to deliver on the promises they've made to consumers and shareholders. We're trying to figure that out. That's the regenerative ag conversation is part of that, for example. How does sustainability, transparency, traceability, organic, domestic, import, how does it all work, right? And none of these companies have figured it out yet. Literally none of them. So we're having those conversations, and then we try to translate that back into the actions that we can take that draws the farming community closer to the food community. Because that seems to be what everybody really wants at the end of the day, is to have a stronger connection between those two ends of the pipe. So you guys, if you really want to become activists in this space, you can talk to your local representative and ask them to support the organic regulations and the new proposed changes to the organic laws. They need to hear from people other than us. I mean, if you take a look at the folks that are at the table on the, what's it called, the anti-fraud, what's it called, Aaron?
Organic import integrity.
The Organic Import Integrity Task Force. There aren't very many farmers participating in that, right? I think it's important for the farming community to participate in these conversations. So the National Organic Program, which oversees the regulations, and then the Organic Trade Association and the National Organic Standards Boards are woefully underpopulated by farmers. A lot of commercial folks involved, but I think that the industry would benefit from having organic farmers participate in that conversation. So that's something that you guys can do if it's a great wintertime activity, right, when nothing else is going on. And then ultimately, you know, if you're interested in, we haven't actually formalized this yet. This is a term that we use internally as the pipeline nation. We want to be careful because we understand that could sound subversive, but to a certain extent, we're trying to be a little subversive. We're trying to create something new here. So we refer internally to our supplier network as the pipeline nation. And today we've got 2,000, give or take, growers across, well, pretty much across the country. You know, a heavy concentration in the Midwest and a heavy concentration in southern Canada. So we've made a good start at pulling the community together. But we're really interested in expanding acres. So if you'd like to talk to us about how we might work together to help you do that, that'd be a great outcome from this meeting. And I'd point you over to my team over here because that's what they're here for. So this is I had this vision in my head. People kept on saying, well, why isn't big ag, why aren't the ABCDs in agriculture doing what you're doing, right? Isn't this their domain? Grain elevators, grain processing. And there's a couple of things. So many, many years ago, early in my career, I walked into a Kmart store, and you know, back then when there were Kmart stores, they used to have these big, at least in the summertime, they had these big wire baskets of balls right there in the front when you walked in. The kids were all over them. And they had a basket of handballs and a basket of kickballs and a basket of beach balls. And for some reason, the picture stuck in my head. In that basket of beach balls, the space in between those beach balls is pretty big. That interstice, right? And anybody who deals with grain elevators understands what I'm talking about, the interstitial area between those balls. And the interesting thing is, as those balls get bigger, the interstitial area gets bigger as well. So I had this picture in my head, and it turns out this is all I've done all my career, is play in those interstitial areas. Because no matter what the big guys want to do, they can't get in there. Geometrically, they can't get in there. You know, if you had a proposal for a new business at Cargill that didn't ring the $25 million cash register in short order, you're going to get laughed out of the meeting. You might be asked to exit, right? So these big businesses just aren't sized right. They do not have the right DNA to operate in this business yet. It's not big enough, and they don't have the right tools. They've got these $250 million facilities that can't segregate for these relatively smaller runs of specialty products, and they don't have the right mindset. That's not the way they were trained. That's not the way I was trained. But for some reason, that's the path I followed. All throughout my career, I've been involved in these specialty markets. So the new picture that came into my mind in terms of trying to explain this in a single picture, and Aaron's husband is the artist that drew this up for me, was, you know, the big guys are walking around with these big wrenches. They got big flywheels. It's a big job. And this is more like watchmaking. It really is more like watchmaking. It takes a different perspective, a different lens that you're looking at the market through. It takes finer tools, it takes more precision. So this is the way I explain how our business model is kind of right now, at least for the time being, sort of impervious to big ag, and also why big ag has left this relatively large interstice in the marketplace that gives us our business opportunity. So I hope that the picture helps sort of explain the situation, right? This is not big ag and won't be for the foreseeable future, but yet a lot of the things we learned in big ag about how to be efficient can be applied to this marketplace for the benefit of both the grower and the consumer. Did I take up enough time? I know that we were worried about, okay. I know we were worried about me getting us to lunch. Any other questions? Anything I left unanswered? Sure.
Will the cost of operation of producing the crop be considered at any time in your program?
Well, the Farm Profit Program, I'm sorry, will the cost of producing organic grains, right, is it be considered? So the farm profit program, starts out on kind of a budget-based view, right? In many cases, you're replacing synthetic inputs with labor. I mean, it's a big part of the program right now. So we take the view that not everybody in every situation is really suited for this, not necessarily due to their own fault, but just due to where they are and the nature of their location, the nature of their soils, the nature of their weather. But it's a budget-based exercise to start with. And that going through that budget is in fact important when we're talking to somebody who hasn't been down this path before. It's one thing if we're talking to a grower who has organic acres and is looking to expand, right? That's a different, because they already know how to do it. They're just looking to get bigger. The guys who haven't done this before, nothing like a budget to describe both the challenges as you go through the transitional period and then what life could look like on the backside to give hope over fear to take that first step. So I think that's core actually to the way that we approach this, is a budget-based view of, here's the range that you can expect for these costs. Here's the range that you can expect for these outcomes. Obviously, yield sits in the middle there, right? And we have something to say about that, but power is much larger than us control that outcome. So, but it is a budget-based approach that we take. So I don't know if does that answer your question?
One side of it.
Well, what's the other side?
The other side is to get over this, for new guys, you gotta get over the psychological effect.
Yeah, well, that's what I said. Somebody said you're going to have to open up a bunch of psychology clinics. That's probably not within our domain, but we've come to appreciate it. To say we understand it would be presumptuous on our part, but we appreciate that challenge, and that's why this idea of connecting growers together has been pretty powerful. And we learned that from other organic growers, right? That network effect is the best long-term strategy for this whole sector to grow. Yes, sir.
Sure. You talked about the Pipeline Nation,
Yeah.
kind of what you're doing. What about strategic alliances are you looking at? Through other areas in livestock or other areas that we all touch the chain. And how are you looking at, from looking at strategic relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we stress that we're open to any conversations around a term that we use very loosely that we call partnerships, right? Same idea. So one manifestation of that so far has been we sit in a very interesting position in the animal protein sector right now. So food companies that are trying to put an organic fed or a non-GMO fed animal protein on the market, meat, milk, or eggs, but particularly the meat sector, there's an issue there that's, you guys probably know better than I do, is called whole carcass utilization. It is a challenge, right? Because every little company's got their little piece of the animal, but the fact is they wind up paying the whole load for that animal, and the balance of that animal oftentimes goes back into the conventional supply chain. So you got an expensive animal coming in the front door, 30% of it getting used in the organic space, and the balance of it there's no market for. Because we're having all these conversations, we're actually starting to piece together the puzzle in our head where we're seeing the opportunity for full animal utilization or closer to full animal utilization. So we've gone out to the packer world and tried to make relationships in the specialty packer world because they're an important part of the equation. And we're just trying to string together and making introductions between food companies and packers and other food companies. Ultimately, we want to provide the feed into this marketplace, but we got to get the corks out of the bottle downstream from us, right? So that's just one example of kind of the way that we think about things.
So from the nutritional side, what are you guys looking at then?
Animal nutrition?
Well, yeah, what's being fed, so
Yeah.
what's mixing with your products,
Yep. I mean, we're a big believer in nutritional density, and we think that the organic space is a perfect way to express that. We have not done a lot of work. I mean, CJ, you'd be closer to this than I am, but we haven't, I don't think, really rolled up our sleeves.
Not yet outside of, everything we've done in terms of entering the meat production marketplace.
Yeah.
Done some work there with some outside groups.
So I think that's going to manifest itself really well when we start investing in feed mills. There's a couple feed mills we're looking at right now, mostly pointed towards organic dairy at this point because it's a big business, right? There's a big opportunity there. There's not very many people serving that. But love to talk, I mean, if that's your space, turn around 180 degrees. The guy you want to talk to is sitting right there. Okay. Oh, yes, sir.
On the import business, how much of that is due to price and how much is due to effective control of cheaters? And how effective is that?
So the question back to the imports, how much of it is due to price? Well, I'd say initially 100% of it's due to price. Price, though, is created by an imbalance between, so high prices is an imbalance between supply and demand, right? So we don't have sufficient supply here in the US to meet the demand. And prices reflected that, and then the imports started coming in. Anytime you have a market that's new and there's a price opportunity, you're gonna have pirates jump into the mix of it, right? So we had some bad actors that came in to this marketplace, and there were a few loopholes in the way the regulations were designed. And
have those loopholes, in your judgment, been effectively controlled?
not yet. Yeah, we're working on it. I mean, I gave a presentation in St. Louis last week. I said we should just chop off their hands and throw them in jail. Why not, right? I mean, they're thieves. They're breaking the law. This is a regulated industry, and they're breaking the law. And so this integrity task force that the NOP, or I guess it's the OTA, the Organic Trade Association, has convened, is intended to put pressure on the USDA, but it's not only going to be up to the government. The government's responsible for the regulations. I'm trying to impress upon the industry that we as an industry are also responsible for self-regulating, because we know who some of these guys are, and they continue to operate. Sometimes they continue to operate, right? And we don't get it. It's out in the light of day. We know who these people are by name. They've been busted a couple times before. The problem is that an organic importer is not required to be certified. So the program didn't give them something like a license to operate that they can take away. That's part of the problem, right? The other part is that if I'm running an organic feed program and I'm short product and somebody tells me that something's organic and I don't have any alternatives, I might do a little bit of this. Don't ask, don't tell. But again, this conversation is alive and well right now, so I expect that it will be corrected relatively soon. And we're on the path towards that. There's already been a big correction. We're not quite done with cleaning things up yet, but we're going in the right direction.
I have a question. You talk a lot about supply, but what is your focus on quality? One of the things I think missing in the marketplace, the consumer is saying they want, is they want food that tastes good, has good flavor, and is nutrient dense. And I don't see either conventional or organic satisfying that palate right now.
It hasn't been discussed enough. I mean, I think there's anecdotal evidence. There's also data, and we're trying to pull together more and more data over and above the anecdotes, over and above the stories. You know, I'm sure producers in this room have experienced themselves with certain practices produce certain outcomes, right? But the consumer says things, the food companies aren't necessarily paying attention. The best place that the rubber hits the road on that is at the animal nutrition side, quite frankly, where you can see what you feed, right?
Well, it starts agronomic.
Well, it starts agronomic, right? But I'm talking about the demand side of this. We want that discussion to be live and well. We would love to see the market focus more on nutrients than calories, right? And I don't know whether this is true or not, but I read something the other day about somebody said that because of the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the increase in carbohydrate production in plants is measurable. And so what the outcome of that is that all plants, all kinds of plants are storing more because they're intaking more carbon, which is carbohydrates, at the expense perhaps of protein and other nutrients. So you've actually got, in all plant species right now, you've got this slow tipping, and you can't necessarily see it with the naked eye, right? But if you do your tests, we've got this slow tipping towards a higher carbohydrate plant world in general, which is kind of weird, right? It's kind of scary. So I think that the more we have this conversation, the more we hope to see a further segregation of the market into higher value, that value being placed on nutrient density. But we got to have a demand signal for that. And that demand signal only shows up in little tiny places in the market right now. It's not a big, broad conversation yet. But we hope it will be. Aaron, you had a question?
I was just going to clarify that the comment about the buyer doing this because they don't have another option.
Yeah.
That's not what we will do. That we absolutely will.
Correct.
But there are buyers out there who are doing that, and that's why it continues.
Well, and I would say, yeah, so the comment was about buyers doing this in lieu of not having any alternative. They just buy something because it says organic. We're talking about it in the grain industry. I meant actually the food companies, right? The food companies have been taking documents in lieu of diligence in some cases. No, as our organization, again, we're not making a lot of friends in some corners of this market already because we're towing the line. We're doing things the way that you read the regulations, it's pretty clear what you're supposed to do. And that's the way that we're going to play the game. So, but that's okay. It always takes somebody's got to stand their ground, and that's the position that we've taken. So I think it's lunchtime. I see people getting antsy. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.